China will not sit on its hands if the situation in Hong Kong worsens. 10 weeks of pro-democracy protests have caused major disruption, and Beijing has deployed large numbers of security personnel to the border. The United States mounts a last-minute bid to stop Gibraltar from releasing an Iranian oil tanker. A decision on the Grace 1 is due this afternoon and could thwart British efforts to reduce tensions with Tehran. And the leaders of Guinea and Ivory Coast joined French President Emmanuel Macron in Provence to pay tribute to the African troops who 75 years ago helped pave the way for the Allied victory in the south of France. Those are the headlines this hour. You're watching France 24. We begin with concerns about China's next move on Hong Kong as hundreds of Chinese paramilitary forces gather just across the border in Shenzhen. 3 senior police officers in Hong Kong say they're unaware of plans for the Chinese army to join their efforts to quell the protests. Meanwhile, Beijing has made it clear once again that patience with the protests, now in their 10th week, is wearing thin.
We've never allowed anyone to undermine one country, 2 systems. Should the situation in Hong Kong deteriorate further into unrest, uncontrollable for the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, the central government would not sit on its hands and watch. We have enough solutions and enough power within the limit of basic law to quell any unrest swiftly.
Well, joining me now is Alessio Palatano from King's College London. Thank you very much for being with us on France 24. Now, we've got this huge troop build-up, haven't we, just across the border from Hong Kong. Is Beijing just trying to send a message, or are they really planning to intervene in the city?
I think it's a mix of both, and one has to be very careful not to dismiss the gathering of the People Armed Police forces in the Shenzhen areas. These are the component of the PLA that is designed to intervene in domestic disorderly situations. And so this is a couple of notches below the army, but still it's much more heavily equipped. In a way, what they're doing there, they're sending a signal, but it's a signal that has 2 different type of audience. One is the protesters in Hong Kong, and we know what that means. And the other one is also to the police in Hong Kong. We have your back. In case you fail to keep this under wraps, we're going to sort of be able to come in and sort of take it further. The words by the ambassador in London were pretty clear. If you compare the press conference he gave today with the one he gave a month ago, the wording is much stronger. It's a sort of language that within what he mentioned being the basic law in China would allow the government to actually step in. But I don't think it's what they want to do for the moment. For the moment, I think the police in Hong Kong still has a sufficient depth to allow it to keep the situation under control. The real problem from Beijing is that they haven't given in an inch towards the request of the protesters, and the protesters haven't stopped. That's a stalemate, and stalemates are always very dangerous.
Right. I mean, Carrie Lam has not even sat down to talk to the protesters. And one of their key demands, of course, is that she step down. Their demands, though, have become increasingly broad over the 10 weeks, haven't they? It is difficult to see how Beijing could meet those demands without losing face. What do you think the long-term strategy is for Hong Kong?
I think at the moment the real problem is that the long strategy is not really a strategy. Beijing is convinced that this thing will come back and sort of will deflate one way or another. But I don't think that the protesters have given any sign that this is similar to the protest that we've seen some time ago, which then sort of like lost momentum and it died of a natural death, if you want. The strategy seems to be very much scaring them, deterring them, coercing them to go back to normal life. But at the same time, this hasn't happened. So at the moment, they're saying there is a tremendous amount of pressure to get this thing sort of under control. But at the same time, unless they give something to the protesters, as you said, as you correctly pointed out, the mistake was not to meet them halfway a few weeks back, hoping that things would just naturally go back to normal. They haven't. They are not going to go back to normality. All the indications are at the moment anyway. Therefore, the government needs to make some sort of a step that would allow them not to lose face fully, but at the very least, give also the protesters a reason to go back to the negotiating table with them. Whether it is Carrie Lam stepping down or, at the very least, guarantee that the extradition law is withdrawn once and for all. This would be a very good sign for the protesters to come back. Even international voices and observers watching the situation have been very clear on the fact that protesters should go back to that calm, quiet engagement type approach.
Alessio Palatano, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you very much indeed. India is marking its 73rd Independence Day, and the Prime Minister has used the occasion to defend ending Kashmir's special status. Narendra Modi said the move to revoke Article 370 would free the region of terrorism. People in Kashmir, meanwhile, remain under a state of lockdown. Mandakini Garlot has this report from New Delhi.
Fairly lengthy speech there. The Prime Minister spoke for 92 minutes. Now, these speeches, the Independence Day speeches, are sort of like the State of the Union address in America, in that it's an opportunity for the Prime Minister to share with the nation his achievements of the previous year and highlight his vision for the upcoming one. So as such, these speeches are usually very carefully analyzed. And today, the Prime Minister addressed a host of important issues, ranging, of course, from Kashmir to the economy to terrorism. What was interesting, though, is the complete absence of Pakistan in that speech, a stark contrast to Prime Minister Imran Khan's independence speech yesterday. Now, of course, the Prime Minister has listed the revocation of Article 370 in Kashmir as one of the major achievements of his government. He said this is an important step towards integrating Kashmir with the rest of the country. But of course, it also comes at a time that this is the 11th consecutive day that Kashmir is under a very severe lockdown.
Mandakini Garlot there. Now, Malaysian officials say the autopsy on Franco-Irish teen Nora Coirin has revealed no signs of foul play and that she likely starved to death. The 15-year-old went missing from her hotel room on August 3rd. Her naked body was discovered 9 days later in a nearby stream. On Wednesday, French prosecutors also opened an investigation into her death.
No suspicion of foul play. That's the conclusion drawn by Malaysian police following a post-mortem examination of Nora Coirin's body.
The main reason for her death is intestinal damage. The intestine was punctured, which could be due to starvation for a long period of time. It could also be due to prolonged stress.
They say the autopsy showed that the Franco-Irish teenager died 2 or 3 days before her nude body was found, about 7 days after she went missing, in a stream less than 3 kilometers from the resort where she'd been staying with her family. They also say they found no evidence that she'd been sexually assaulted. The 15-year-old disappeared from a nature resort some 63 kilometers south of Kuala Lumpur on August 3rd. Her parents insisted that Nora, who had learning and physical disabilities, wouldn't have ventured out alone. A group of volunteers helping in the search discovered her body 10 days later in an area that teams had already covered.
We had stopped about 10 meters away from the body. We all understood we should not go too close to the scene of the body. We do not want to destroy or disturb any evidence if there is.
Nora's father's French nationality has prompted the Paris prosecutor's office to open its own criminal probe into her death on potential kidnapping charges. On Wednesday, Nora's family released a statement thanking the more than 350 volunteers who took part in the search, saying their hearts are broken by an unbearable loss.
The United States has made a last-minute bid to stop Gibraltar from releasing an Iranian oil tanker. The Grace 1 was stopped by the Royal Marines on July 4th. In response, Iran seized a British-flagged vessel in the Straits of Hormuz. Well, the US says the Grace 1, which is carrying Iranian oil, is in breach of international sanctions. Authorities in Gibraltar will make a decision at 4 o'clock Central European time. Benedict Pavio is in London with more on how this move by the US is hurting British efforts to end a standoff with Tehran.
We have this diplomatic standoff since early July when the Grace 1, this Iranian supertanker carrying a lot of oil, we think, in breach of EU sanctions against Iran. And it seems that that oil was on its way to Syria, which is obviously in violation of those sanctions. And ever since there has been that standoff. But what we knew, particularly under this new Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we knew that there was this latest attempt at de-escalation. So it had been thought that this afternoon there would be a confirmation by Gibraltar's Supreme Court, by its Attorney General, that a Grace 1, this Iranian tanker, would actually be free to go along with the personnel on board. But now this last-minute US Department of Justice request clearly has put a huge spanner in these works. We understand that this decision was initially supposed to be taken by Gibraltar this morning. Now we understand the latest is that at 3 p.m. London time, 4 p.m. Paris time, there will be a decision made by Gibraltar's Attorney General. But of course, what we already know is that the Iranians had retaliated just 2 weeks later because they had actually stopped a British flag carrying the Stena Impero tanker and that they confiscated it, took it from what the British say are international waters into Iranian waters. And that tanker is actually at the moment with all its personnel that is mostly, actually, I believe none of them are British on board, but from various different countries. They are stuck in Iran. So instead of having a denouement, what we've got is a further standoff with this much awaited decision now in Gibraltar. The latest we're hearing from the British Foreign Office, the British Foreign Ministry, is that it is unable to comment on the fate of Iranian tanker Grace 1.
Benedict Pavio there. Now, the leaders of Guinea and Ivory Coast joined the French President Emmanuel Macron in the southern French town of Saint-Raphael today to mark 75 years since World War II's Operation Dragoon. The so-called Second D-Day paved the way for the Allied invasion of the region, and troops from France's former African colonies played a key role in the battle. Catherine Kedir-Clifford has this report.
75 years on, veterans of France's African army still remember their old marching songs. 450,000 men landed in the southern Provence as a follow-up to the D-Day landings in Normandy, well over half of them French from the then Empire's colonies. As a mark of respect, Emmanuel Macron invited both his Ivorian and Guinean counterparts to pay tribute.
At this moment, when France, with the aid of her allies, was fighting for her survival and freedom, the sons and daughters of Africa felt called, involved, and shared the absolute and universal call of freedom.
Attending the proceedings, former President Nicolas Sarkozy, who raised pensions for African veterans to be in line with the rest of the armed forces in 2010. Now Macron has made his own overtures to honour those often overlooked by history.
These African fighters, for many decades, did not receive the glory and esteem that they deserved for their bravery. France has a part of Africa within her, and that's why I am today launching an appeal to mayors across France to bring it to life, in the names of our streets and squares, our monuments and ceremonies, the memories of these men who make all Africa proud.
France has had an often sensitive relationship with her former colonies, but 3/4 of a century after they overwhelmingly helped to liberate the nation from Nazi occupation, all were united in remembrance of their common struggle.
Dozens of Catholics have held an emotional procession outside the Notre Dame Cathedral here in Paris today, 4 months after a devastating fire. It's to mark the Christian holy day of Assumption. Worshippers carried with them a nearly 200-year-old statue of the Virgin Mary that was rescued from the flames. This year's ceremony was a much more low-key affair due to the works and restricted areas around the cathedral. Well, that's it from the newsroom for now. Thanks for watching. This is France 24.